Alright, hello everyone, welcome back to another Big Deno painting video. In this video I'm going to be painting Styx from Aradia Miniatures, some awesome sculpts from a variety of interesting topics. This one is from Dante's Inferno, I believe, which is a very famous poem from a long time ago. Anyway, so this guy's a crazy demon rhinoceros bebop rocksteady guy, and the focus of this video is going to be on different skin tones and some object source lighting. So we'll dive in here with a way I often start models, not always, and this is a bit of wet in wet. So this is just an acrylic paint, and I've added a small amount of a Joe Sonia Magic Mix, which is a medium, and that just helps extend the drying time by a little bit, not a lot. And I've got 2 or 3 colors there. So this is a sort of a darkish red, which I believe is Burned Flesh from Nocturna Colors, and then I'm mixing in a variety of purples, light purples, Orchid Light from Nocturna, and some other lighter colors. I think I've mixed a little bit of Vallejo Model Color Ivory in there as well. Just for the record, so this is stated very early on, this was painted approximately 3 weeks ago, and there is a very high possibility that I've forgotten everything that I've done. So this will be just as much of a learning experience for me as it will be for all of you. But I do remember the main broad strokes. So just here you can see the drying time extension here, and this video is done at ×2 speed for the entirety of the video. So we've got approximately an hour and 20 minutes of painting. You can see how long that medium extends the drying time. It's pretty useful for this technique and some other stuff which you'll see later on. So here's another one of my great tricks, which is the hairdryer. I find it very, very useful to just speed up the drying and help you get on and get painting again. So this is just a fairly thick layer of Orchid Light mixed with Burned Flesh, the 2 colors that were used in the base coat. But because it's a much higher concentration of the Orchid Light, you can see the different shift. So I went with purples here. I feel like purples are an interesting color for skin tone base, and I also wanted to keep a lot of warmth in the skin. I wanted it to be a fairly warm sort of skin. I wanted it to be a very cold skin because the warmth from the OSL would be coming in afterwards. So completely ignore what I said 10 seconds ago. Cold skin. So I did start with a slightly warmer Burned Flesh, but the colors that I'm moving up into are a much colder color. And that's one of the strengths of purple, is you can have warm and cold purples. You can have warm and cold variations of most colors, although you don't tend to see a lot of warm blues. You don't tend to see a lot of cold reds, but they are doable. So here, this part of what I'm doing is what I like to call sketch and refine. So this part of my process is just roughly blocking out where I want lights and leaving the shadows in place. There's not a lot of precision here. It is rough and ready, but the later stages of what I do helps to smooth and refine that out fairly quickly. So here I'm just really focusing on getting the placement of the light where I want it. And with this particular piece, I am starting with two light sources. So you've got the deep red light from below, representing hell or whatever else. I don't know, actually, I've never read the poem. And then a colder light coming from above. So the highlighting and placement of lights that I'm doing now is obviously reflective of that light coming from above. And we will talk about the light from below a little bit later on in the process. So again, this is very imprecise, rough, quick sketches. You can see there's a lot of roughness, and there's a lot of variation between the various areas, but the next steps of this process will help to smooth and refine that. If you haven't watched any of my previous videos, I would recommend the painting Yakun or painting a female face. They're two where you can watch the process, and I'll explain it in a little bit more detail and why I do things the way that I do. So this one is more of a specific look into certain concepts, which is unnatural skin tones and object source lighting or directional lighting. So the purple skin tone is something that this starts with. It's very rare for the colors that I use to stay exactly as I initially have them. There's a lot of change over the course of painting a model, just little shifts and subtle nuances that change, and often that is conscious change, and sometimes it is unconscious because I decide I don't like something. So in this particular case, the skin tone does go through a little bit of variation, but it does stay around this sort of zone. So here I'm mixing in Orchid Light with a little bit of Vallejo Game Color Emerald, which is a green. And the reason I've used this, it's a very pale green. It's sort of like a minty color. The reason I've used green is because I wanted to, and that is really the only reason. I think you can get caught up sometimes in what color you should use and you know why you use a specific color, or you know, Games Workshop's method of highlighting gives you specific color recipes, and I think you can create some interesting textures, colors, visual interest by just trying different things. Doesn't always work, but it's often worth trying. In this case, I don't actually think it works, but we're able to recover that and do something slightly different to adjust it, and then come back to the green at later stages. It's probably not fair to call it a green because it is very much a pale ivory color with a greenish tinge. If anyone remembers the old Games Workshop paints, it's mostly like Games Workshop Rotting Flesh, but perhaps with a tinge more blue. So one comment I will make at this point, you can see that we're starting to lose a little bit of, like, the colors starting to look a little bit washed out. So I was testing a new lighting setup with this. I've obviously got the black cardboard at the back, and I actually stopped the camera from auto setting the light, and I think at this point it's probably catching a little bit too much light. So I do amend that a little bit later on in the video, and you'll see how much that actually changes the look of the model, just the darker light. So, all right, here's the refined part of the process, or at least the first stage. So this is the airbrush. It's an Iwata, and the color I've used here through the airbrush is a color called Duck Egg Green, and I've actually mixed a little bit of that Orchid Light in. And so because Duck Egg Green was the color I chose as opposed to that emerald color, it's also got a little bit of yellowish tinge to it, the Duck Egg Green, and so it's actually subtly shifting this into a more warmer zone, which isn't exactly what I wanted, but it's also helping to soften and bring all of the colors together, smoothing out some of those rough transitions and giving me a little bit more of a base to work on. Perhaps the transitions from emerald through to the burned flesh were quite sharp, and this just homogenizes everything and draws it all together. And so the real strength of the airbrush is just how fluid, no pun intended, and dynamic you can be with your usage of colors. This is a great shot. Look at the top of that scythe. Fascinating. So I go through and add quite a few little color nuances here, and I'll continue to do that over the course of this paint job with the airbrush, just quickly adding little subtle shifts and changes. And this is actually using a Games Workshop contrast paint, Volupus Pink, and it's kind of got similar tones to the original base skin tone. The reason I didn't use the original base skin tone is I wanted a translucent color. I didn't want to use something that would cover over the layers. I wanted something that would filter and shift the tones slightly. So Volupus Pink was the option, and you can see the angles that I sprayed that at were from below, and oh, there it is, Volupus Pink, very good, and very, very controlled. So here I've gone a little bit heavier and a little bit more direct face on as opposed to from below. So we're starting to see a lot more impact on the torso and the colors. And so this is, again, as I said before, the strength of the airbrush. You can shift and adapt to tones that you've used. Take what was initially a cold purple and turn it into a warm green, and then bring it back into cold purple territory. And this has taken about 25 minutes so far. And that's what the finished skin tone, I used finished in air quotes, through the airbrush, through the glaze, the sketch and refine technique looks like. So I talk a lot about contrast in some of the other videos. So again, I'll just recommend checking some of those out. And in this particular context, the contrast I'm referring to is the contrast between light and dark. And one of the the really good ways to see this in action is exactly what I'm doing right now. So that skin tone looked very, very pale and washed out to some extent, but the actual color is influenced by the colors that are around it. And so because there was gray tones around it, it was making that area look paler than it actually was. So by filling in some of the other areas with some color, like in this instance a very, very dark blue, what you're doing is you're allowing your eyes to look at the piece a little bit closer to what it's actually going to look like. So this step is an important one, and you'll see I actually in some cases do it several times as I do multiple layers of airbrushing or change my mind about colors. But it's always bringing it back to, I want to be able to visualize what the piece is actually looking like instead of what it looks like with a grey undercoat next to it. A great example of this is when you dry brush a base. just the old Games Workshop bases with the sand, you dry brush them. If you then paint the edge black, all of a sudden the base looks much cleaner and much easier to register and more finished. Well, this is exactly the same as that, except you're not doing it with a base, you're doing it with other elements on the model. So here is Signal Blue from Vallejo Model Air and Chimera Black. I just mixed those two together to get a very dark bluey black. The reason I mixed those two colours together, they're both very dilute but quite strong, and I think I had some on my palette for some reason. I don't remember. I did plan for a lot of the other elements on this. I wanted this model to be just very much interesting skin and light from below. So I didn't want a lot of the other elements to be overpowering that. So by making this area blacky, bluey black, it just means all the focus stays on the red glow and the skin tone. So yeah, this model, really interesting textures, really interesting volumes on the skin. Super cool model to paint. I think for people that have never watched any of my painting videos before, or for those that have, I've never claimed to be a great painter, but I certainly can lay claim to being a very quick painter. And this model was a good challenge for me because it wasn't really something I think you can do quickly. There's a lot of elements to it that sort of want you to go a little bit deeper and start, working with those interesting textures and volumes. And I think this paint job actually ends up probably taking slightly longer than some of my other ones, although not all of it is on film. The main focus of the film is obviously the skin tone and that red light. So one of the downsides of the airbrush is the way that it works, which is also its strength, is just how it homogenizes everything together. So the way that I use it, the airbrush will bring light highlights down, so it will actually make those highlights darker and filter them down towards a mid-tone, but it will also have the same effect on the shadows. It will make the shadows come closer to your mid-tone as well. So one important stage for me and for the process that I use is going back in and re-adding contrast to shadows. And these skin folds are a really great example of the contrast needing to be re-added to get that clear separation between those volumes. So this is a colour called Arbuckle's Brown. It's from scale 75, and it's kind of a purpley brown, very dark colour. It's a scale fantasy range, and they tend to be a little bit tricky to work with sometimes if you're not experienced them before, because they are slightly transparent. So for the purposes of this, it's actually exactly what I want, so that I'm not completely removing all of the work that I've done underneath, and am able to slightly get some smoother blends because of the transparent nature of the colour. But it is also quite dark and purpley, and yeah, I felt like it was a good colour to just break those shadows back and bring them back into the model. He's got heaps of cool wrinkles and interesting shapes here. I haven't really got much to add at this point. This is all, again, just adding those shadows back in. I will sort of mention at this point that deciding how to highlight and shade volumes is probably up there with most important things that you need to understand in terms of painting, alongside brush control, dilution, colour theory. They're probably all sort of very important ones to know. But really, how light interacts on a surface is almost the first thing you need to understand before you start putting paintbrush to a model, because you won't know where it should go if you don't have that understanding. And so this sort of model is a really good one to practice on because of the variety of volumes and textures and shapes. You've got a lot of different shapes that you can try out, and the advantage of doing the different lighting from above and below gives you, again, more interesting volumes to sort of play with and interact with light. That's when you're painting a little toy soldier like this, you are just basically trying to envisage the environment that it exists in, and then try to replicate that on the model. And that's probably the thing that I enjoy the most about painting. There's lots of things I enjoy about painting, but it's almost like a puzzle. It's something that you just sort of mull over as you're painting. You know, there's not a lot of heavy concentration required, but just sort of thinking about, well, how's the light going to bounce here, and where should this highlight be, and how much shadow should be in this location, and those sorts of questions are just almost subconscious questions that you ask yourself after a while. But they're also the fun and the real challenge, and what makes painting different models interesting. And it's also when you get to break those rules and follow the one most important rule of all, which is called the rule of cool. Alright, so we've brought back in that emerald and mixed in a small touch of the duck egg green with the emerald. So we've got a mixture of those two. And again, we're going back in and really pumping up the lights. So the topic of this video was supposed to be different skin tones, and when I sort of finished painting this model and started thinking about how I was going to commentate this video, I sort of realized that it's not actually that different to the skin tones that I normally paint. And the reason for that is, that was my cat meowing if you heard her. That's Peach. Oh, taking that away for a second. Boom, we're back. The reason it's not very much different is because I tend to have higher value skin tones, and by value obviously I'm referring to light and dark. So I tend to have the skin tones be the lightest part of the model and the other areas be darker, so the skin tone is the main focal point. And so I think probably what may have been more valuable was to actually work on a darker skin tone. And so I'm probably going to do something like that for another video. This ends up being like an albino rhino demon guy thing. Chap. So, but I don't know how valuable that is compared to my normal approach. Anyway, just some very, very helpful idle musings there. So, as I mentioned a little earlier in the video, we are about to go to that lighting shift. This is definitely washing out a little bit compared to what it looks like in the hand. You're seeing those areas look almost white, whereas in actuality they're a slightly more cream and green color. So very shortly I switch the lighting on the camera, and you should be able to see that immediately and how that changes. So here Arbuckle's brown, just shading in some of these scale surface skin disorders that he's got. Leprosy, eczema, psoriasis. Not sure what Rhino Demon guys have. I'm sure it's some sort of condition. So Rhino Demon guy and his skin disorders. Outstanding. You can clearly see now, based on where I've focused my highlighting and where I'm focusing my shadows, where the light source is coming from. You can see it's very clearly coming from the top left, and that all of the highlighting and shading is reinforcing that appearance. So, as I discussed in a couple of my other videos, it's always the very first thing you should consider. Where's my light source? And allow that to influence all of your decisions around where you should highlight. And that's what I'm doing here. It's all very, very considered. And then we're going to throw it all out the window when we start adding a second light source in the next video. Bum bum bum. So this is about an hour's worth of painting, and I think probably for me, I would normally expect to be a little more progressed after an hour. And I think, again, this model is deceptively tricky because even though it's just skin, there's a lot of, folds of skin, flaps, weird textures. Hey, there you go. So that is actually a little more accurate to what the model looks like in the hand. So I think you can see there how much of a difference the lighting can make. So that skin tone is duck egg green and a little bit of emeralds and maybe a smidge of orchid light. I don't tend to be very precise with anything, but skin tones or mixes is one area where natural variation works in your favor, I think. So by having just those little subtle shifts and nuances between, you create a more realistic finish in the end. So probably wish I had have got that lighting right in the first couple of clips, because that might have given you a bit better idea of the colours. Anyway, it is what it is. So here I'm starting to add, you can see I've moved to a smaller brush, and I'm starting to add it's just some micro texturing type of thing. Micro is not the right word. I don't think I've ever done anything micro. But just some textured, some lines, some little sort of interesting visual things, because it is a fairly large flat surface, and having some small texturing can help break that up. I think probably one of my weaknesses, maybe idiosyncrasies is probably a better word, is I don't tend to do very smooth paint jobs. I do have the capacity to do smooth paint jobs, as evidenced by some of my other works, but I tend to stick much more in really interesting texturing, scratches, colors, and I feel like in the larger scales this works better. So this is a 75mm scale, and I feel like the texturing sort of helps create visual interest as you're making your way around looking at the model. So the colours I'm playing with here are just those same ones that I've got on the palette: Arbuckle's brown, duck egg green, orchid light, burnt flesh, and VGC emerald. And it's just really playing around with those, reinforcing the shadows, getting more light where I want it. And I am actually going to do more airbrushing on this skin tone to, again, help soften some of those textures and smooth out some of those blends, but also to add more nuances and more interesting colors and shapes, textures. It's just such a powerful tool and super fun to use. So I think probably I'm using it more now than at any point in the past with my painting. Don't know if it's always speeding up my process. Generally, I would say it does. But there's certain elements where, I did a lot of lining in there with the Arbuckle's brown to reinforce shadows. Had I just done smoother blends in the first place, would it have been easier? Maybe. But then you don't get to use your airbrush. Paintbrushes, Winsor & Newton Series 7. Seeing a lot of people talk about having bad batches of Winsor & Newton Series 7. I feel like a saying that comes to mind is your very worst day at golf is still better than your best day at work. I feel very similarly about Winsor & Newtons. Don't know that there's any other brushes that have ever come close to them. Even a bad Winsor & Newton still feels like a better product. I have tried other ones, but yeah. Having said that, I did get one very, very bad Winsor & Newton recently that basically splayed from day one. And if I didn't have an immediate backup Winsor & Newton, and in fact I have about 7 of them just ready to go, I might have been more upset. But as it was, I just switched it over and used it as a glue brush and stuff. Wasn't a big deal. I also purchased my brushes from Irresistible Force, Miniature Games and Hobbies, based in Brisbane, and they actually do very competitively priced Winsor & Newton brushes comparative to the marketplace. So it's the other reason I don't get too worried. I tend to go through one brush about every 3 months or so. A brush normally, if it's looked after, will last you significantly longer than that, but most people don't paint quite as often as I do. So this is Arbuckle's brown. I think I actually added a little bit of Volupus pink into this as well. This last 5 or 10 minutes of painting has just been repetition of the same things I've done, so I haven't had much value to add. And in fact, at this point, I'm going to go silent until there is something of value that I can add. Alright, I'm painting some blue here. I should probably talk about the blue. It's a blue. Yep. No, there was a considered reason for it to be blue, and I will share that with you right now. I've got red light from below, I got blue clothes, and I got a purple skin tone. Keeps everything in the same bit of the colour wheel. They're all side by side. I'm sure it's some sort of special name, like a analogous colour scheme or a tetradic colour scheme or something like that. I'm sure someone will tell me what it is. But that's pretty much it. It's blue because of that reason. The one thing I will say here, so this is probably where we begin contemplating the secondary light source. And the reason I say that that is happening now is because of how I choose to highlight this. I don't do much, if any, lighting on the bottom part of the what is that thing called again? Tabard. I'm having a rough night, I've got to tell you. It's been a busy week. It's been a busy couple of weeks. I'm sure it's a loincloth or a dangly thing. Anyway, so the dangly thing is what I'm painting at the moment. And I don't do a lot of work on the bottom of the dangly thing because I know that that is going to be quite heavily done in the red lighting. So I focus most of my highlighting on the upper section and also respecting where the direction of that top light is coming from. So the second video in this will focus a lot more on the red and the light from below. So I haven't talked too much about it at this stage, but one thing that is cool about the way I approach this, which is to say that not really starting with the light in play, but adding it a little bit later on, means you get to work back and forth between the two and really help integrate them together. Whereas if you started with the light and then the other colors on there, you might not get that same sense of the two things working together. I mean, ultimately, the way I see it is this light is it's happening to an object. So this object already exists before the light hits it. So sort of this method of starting with the object, painting the object with the colors that it's supposed to be, and then adding the light afterwards sort of reflects what happens in life. Maybe. So I am actually mixing in the emerald color into that blue to keep a similar highlight color to the skin. So you've got a real sense of unification, sense of harmony between the two elements, which is super cool. And this is just more black lining. There's a little chain there on his hip thing. I'm not sure what it's holding. Probably don't want to know, actually. And here's some strappy things. Painting these little strappy wraps, cloth wraps. So one thing I'll say about the way I paint is I make a lot of mistakes, and I also don't worry at all about those mistakes. I just keep going and try different things. And there's been paint jobs, if you follow me on Twitter or Instagram, there's been paint jobs that I've done where my end product has varied quite dramatically from where I started with some of the colors. This one isn't one of those. I tend to get everything pretty much how I wanted it with this, so that's nice. But I really had no idea what I wanted to do with the wings. I sort of thought I was going to do them a different color, or that maybe I was going to try and do some really super fancy airbrushing and like paint on veins and red dots, and then use the airbrush to like do super translucent layers, the way they use it, an airbrush to do makeup. And oh, we're finished. Oops. Ah, well, very sorry about that, friends. Anyway, I'll catch you on the next video where we focus on the red light. Thank you.